All right, so we're going to talk about the Phillips curve. Relevance to it, what they ask you on the AP exam, and so much, and so forth. So, a couple of things to take away, or a couple of things to look at. This is the Phillips curve as it's drawn, as you should draw it. Now, you don't necessarily have to draw with a bend. I like drawing it straight line, simply because it just makes it so that moving and manipulating it and also understanding it when you have changes in inflation or unemployment, it makes it a little bit, I think, easier if you draw as a straight line as opposed to a bend in it, but it really doesn't matter. I think what makes this difficult is this is one of those graphs in econ where it gets confusing in that usually a shift to the left is a bad thing, right? That's usually a decrease in quantity, or it means that, like in an ag demand, ag supply graph, you're going in a recessionary gap. But in this case, you have to understand that if your x-axis is employment or unemployment, and that's the important part of it, is the fact that it's unemployment here, that remember that the further left you go, that's close to zero, that the intersection between the y and x-axis is zero. So remember that, because like I said, that ends up becoming a big part and a kind of confusing part in this whole thing. And then you've got inflation on your y-axis. So as inflation increases, you tend to have less unemployment, which is kind of a double negative. So another way to say that is you have more employment. Again, that's what makes this confusing, is the term unemployment being on your x-axis. So as the video, the quick 60-second video showed, or tried to tell you, was as less and less people become unemployed, or as more and more people are employed, in order for businesses to maintain their current employees, they need to then incentivize them to stay by higher wages. So let's say, like right now is a good example of what's happening in the economy. Now, this is where the Phillips curve actually flattens out. So will there be kinked Phillips curve or flat Phillips curves? Will you have to draw this kind of like a upside down L at some point? Maybe. And like I said, if you want to get your PhD in econ, you go ahead and get a brand new Phillips curve or update the Phillips curve, and there you go. You can do that for your doctorate. But as it stands right now, you simply only have to worry about straight lines. But imagine a situation where you're living in Colorado. Colorado happens to be the #1 economy in the country right now, as far as the 50 states go. The Colorado ranks as #1. Texas quickly follows after that. So it's expensive to live here, and so I go to Valor and I say, hey, I need a raise. I need a raise in order to live and keep up with current standards of, the food prices are rising because people keep immigrating here. And Valor, because they want to keep me, I'll go through a scenario when we do supply and demand in January for micro, where I'll show you using elasticity, you can make yourself unfireable. And then imagine that I'm the last one to leave this place. So Valor says, yeah, we agree that we want to keep you, and so we're going to continue to raise your wages. Great. But as everybody else is doing that too, and businesses, because they want to maintain employees, because again, the pool that they're picking from because of low unemployment is rather shallow. And so they can either say, no, bozo, go find a job somewhere else, and then they're picking somebody from a shallower pool of applicants, either somebody with less experience or can't teach all the classes I do. So that's their trade-off, and so they agree, just like other businesses are agreeing, to maintain their good employees. So they continue to give me raises. Inflation then increases because prices are increasing, and so what the video says is ultimately that will then lead to unemployment. And that all long explanation is basically to show you that inflation tends to follow lower levels of unemployment. Okay? So you've got the short-term Phillips curve. So what he did was he plotted throughout the entire 20th century inflation and unemployment, and he figured out that there is basically an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. As prices increase, people are asking for raises, and also businesses are outputting more. And then on the flip side, as people are laid off, as you hit recessions, then you tend to have a falling of prices or lower percentages of inflation. And like I said, right now we're kind of in an odd point in the Phillips curve. We're kind of in a flat where we continue to improve the amount of people or increase the amount of people that are employed, but inflation remains relatively low. So it's, like I said, it's more of a plateau than it is a curve. All right. A few things have said, so that's just kind of an explanation of what the Phillips curve is. What you guys are probably more interested in is, what are you going to ask me, or what is AP going to ask me on my test? Okay, here we go. One, they're going to want to make sure you label the graph and that you have the graph correct. Okay, inflation on the Y, unemployment on the X. I can't tell you the number of tests that I've seen that have employment on the X. That's a good way to lose points. Okay, they specifically, the graders are looking for unemployment. That's one of those things that they don't trade off. Just like the loanable funds mark and the money supply graph, all right, they're looking for inflation, interest rates on the Y in those two graphs. That's not a trade-off. You can't put something and get it right. Different on that. On this one, you can't put employment and get it right on the X. You have to have unemployment, and of course, they're looking for inflation. One thing that this graph doesn't show that I always suggest that you draw is the long-run Phillips curve, which is just simply a straight line right here. Long-run Phillips curve. So what was basically discovered, or what happened, was they realized that much like your ag demand, ag supply curve that you're going to see here in just a minute, there is no, once you hit a certain level of unemployment, okay, you're just simply trading off inflation. Or in the ag demand, ag supply graph, you're simply trading off price level increases. Okay, is there a point of unemployment that will always happen? Is there always going to be unemployment? Yes. Yes, there will be. That's known as the natural rate of unemployment. Good. So this long-run Phillips curve is drawn at the natural rate of unemployment, which we know it as 5% unemployment. So you draw your long-run Phillips curve at 5% unemployment. Okay, that's the natural rate of unemployment. Now, is inflation then equal to zero in this case? Not necessarily, but that's a good place to start, because you're going to have to manipulate the Phillips curve. So you draw it like this. That's going to be the first part of the question. It's going to say something along the lines of country X is in long-run equilibrium, and then it'll have you draw the Phillips curve to that. This is how you show that, and this is how you end up with the points. Again, you need the natural rate of unemployment, the long-run Phillips curve at the natural rate of unemployment to show that you're in long-run equilibrium. There's no way to do that otherwise. Okay, the only way you could do that is by putting 5% on your X, some point of inflation. If you knew the inflation rate at the long-run unemployment, long-run equilibrium is, let's say, 3, maybe you could do it, but really the only way to do that is by drawing your long-run Phillips curve. All right, so how does the College Board ask, or AP ask, all of this stuff? All right, and the answer back to you is it's going to ask you by making sure that you can apply this into your ag demand, ag supply graph. All right, so we've got both graphs side by side here. Okay, remember that in long run, equilibrium, okay, in order to show that on the graph on the right, okay, you're going to have to draw in your long run Phillips curve. Now, is the long run Phillips curve the same thing as long run aggregate supply? Sort of. Okay, it's placed at the same spot, at the natural rate of unemployment. Where it gets kind of tricky is that, remember, on the ag demand, ag supply graph, on the one on the left, what is the x-axis labeled as? It's not labeled as unemployment, it's labeled as real GDP or output, right? Total output. So long run Phillips curve isn't a measure of total output, it's a measure of the natural rate of unemployment. So it kind of gets tricky there. So the only way to move long run Phillips curve is if the natural rate of unemployment changes. They could ask that. They could say the natural rate of unemployment now becomes 3%. So that means you'd have to shift the long run Phillips curve to the left on this graph. That's where it becomes, I think, a little tricky. All right, so you've got a situation where this point, let's say that's point A, and this point is point A. Okay, so you've got the natural rate of unemployment is 5%. That's where you drew your Phillips curve. Could I draw my long run Phillips curve, the original one, to the left of where I drew it and label that point A, like I'm going to do here in just a second? The answer is yes, you can. Okay, so let me exit out of here and redraw this so that you kind of see. And discard that. And let's say I draw it like this. Whoops. Let's say I draw it like this. Long run Phillips curve. Now point A becomes this point, and that equals this one over here. Okay? So I didn't move the long run Phillips curve. I just drew it in a different spot. Okay? I'm showing you that because this kind of gets confusing of where I drew it. Do you always have to draw it at zero inflation? The answer is no. Okay, you can draw it at a different spot. Yeah.
If natural rate of unemployment went from 5% to 3%, would your long run aggregate supply curve shift, right?
No, that's why these don't always correlate. No, they don't. It doesn't. It just stays the same. That's a good question. All right, so that's why they don't always equal one another. Okay? And if your potential output increases, your economy grew, remember your PPF curve shifted out, your long run Phillips curve doesn't move unless the natural rate of unemployment changes. Yep. All right. So here's how they ask stuff on the AP exam. Okay, let's say that you have a situation where ag demand decreases. Oh, sad. Which means you're in what? A recessionary gap. Okay, ag demand decreases. Ag demand decreases. Sad emoji face, right? Okay, so what's happened here? Okay, good. Price level decreases. Okay, so you have a decrease in price level 1. And your potential output also decreased, right? That's a movement left on the graph. Well, why don't we move left on the Phillips curve? No, you don't, right? That would be wrong. And again, that's why this gets, I think, confusing is you move one way on one graph, you move the other way on the other. Here's one thing to make sure you star in your notes. When ag demand moves, it's a movement along the short run Phillips curve. And I'm going to go ahead and repeat that. When ag demand moves, it's a movement along the short run Phillips curve. When ag demand moves, it's a movement along the short run Phillips curve. Okay, so that's going to be point B right there. All right, as you guys correctly said, price level has dropped. Remember that inflation is a flame that either carries price level up or it cools down and price level drops. So inflation is that mover. All right, so price level has dropped, but so has employment. And again, this is where this gets confusing because you use the term employment and unemployment. People tend to get those confused. So employment has dropped, meaning what has increased? Unemployment has increased. Okay, good. Is there a situation on your short run Phillips curve that you can show that?
Yeah.
Yeah, where is it?
To the right of A.
Good, to the right of A, right? So anytime you have a recessionary instance, okay, where ag demand has shifted left, you move to the right of long-run equilibrium is shown on the Phillips curve. Again, that's where this gets confusing. You're moving one direction on one graph, and you're moving the dot on the other graph the other direction. So recessionary, you're to the right of long-run equilibrium. Inflationary, an inflationary gap, you're going to be to the left. Okay, so if you have a situation now, again, let's redraw this situation here. Okay, so again, you want to make sure, I always like to put my long run Phillips curve in. Okay, you have a situation where you have demand pull inflation. Okay, you're just like the scenario I gave you, we're operating really well as an economy, and I go to Valor and I keep asking for raises, and they keep giving them to me because they want to make sure they maintain their employees, and so now you have an inflationary situation here. We're going to label that point C. So I'd redraw the graphs if I were you, but it's up to you. Now you've got a situation where output has actually gone beyond potential output. And in order to do that, businesses either need to continue to hire more people, or you need a situation where people are working longer hours. So eventually people are going to burn out, and you've got to hire more people, which means what's happened to unemployment? It has decreased, dropped. Okay, and you've got a situation where now people are commanding higher and higher wages. So because people have higher wages, prices go up. And you have a situation where point C then, and an inflationary gap is to the left of equilibrium. All right, now this can't be maintained. Okay, if it is maintained, then that means that your potential output, the total amount of output in the economy, right, your production possibility curve, that doesn't look like that, but your production possibility curve now has to shift, and that'll shift long-run ag supply. Okay, that's the only way you can maintain where you're at right now. And remember, that's an increase in productivity, increase in physical availability of resources, increase in technology, increase in education, those kind of things. Increase in capital goods, stuff like that. Yeah?
Okay, so when you're in a recessionary gap, your percentage of unemployment will go down?
No, the percentage, if you're in a recessionary gap, the percentage of unemployment will increase. So it's moving further away from the zero mark. It's moving this direction.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, see, that's how this can be confusing. All right, so let's say that's not maintainable. Let's say those things that move production possibility curve does not happen. So this doesn't happen. Okay, instead now the economy has to return to long-run equilibrium. There's two ways it can happen. AD can decrease. Okay, we can all as a nation decide, uh-oh, this is bad, inflation, and then I'll stop spending. So no iPhone X or 10 for you guys, right? Or you can do what actually really happens, right? And we continue to consume. Businesses continue to invest because they're like, sweet, people are buying our stuff. So invest. And then what ends up happening is then there's a light that shines. Okay, and it's not the light that you're thinking of. Instead, it's the light that shines that says, hey, remember that whole limited resources thing that you learned about in econ? Yeah, that's happening. And so now we start to realize, all these resources that we continue to collect, whether it's skilled employees or it's resources like natural resources, they're becoming fewer and fewer. That does what to the price of those resources? It increases them, right? In that increase, remember, there are only a few things that affect ag supply. One of the biggest ones are input prices. Okay, so those input prices happen. And so they also increase. Also, the problem with all of us deciding like, we're done consuming, remember the ratchet effect? All right, which basically means that if price level increases, it's not going to decrease. Okay, businesses aren't going to all of a sudden all agree like, yeah, and we should also agree to drop all of our prices. No, and it's not going to, deflation won't happen. So at least in that situation where you've got a increased price level tends not to fall on an aggregate scale. Okay, so you have input prices that have increased now. Okay, so businesses like Valor, because they're paying me higher and higher salaries, that means they have less money then to invest in like seats and desks and computers and technology. And because more and more people are buying those anyways, the prices of those have skyrocketed, which means that they can now, the only thing they can do is produce less because they're paying me more money. They're paying more for input things like technology and desks and stuff like that. So that will decrease your ag supply.
Supply goes down.
Okay, ag supply will decrease. All right, so that's gonna, now we got point D on here. All right, now we've got kind of an issue, right? We're back at full employment. But we have high prices too. Is there any way to show that on the current Phillips curve, the way that it's drawn? Is there a way to show high inflation levels up here and also return back to this line?
Long run. Could you just like go a little and just push it up a little bit?
So like, whoop, like what are you talking, like to get to point D, what are we gonna have to do? Whoop, move the whole, yeah, exactly, move the entire line, okay? Short run Phillips curve. So what moved, what was the movement along the short run Phillips curve? What moved the dot on the Phillips curve? AD moved the dot. Ag supply will move the line. Ah, yeah, tricky. So, in order to prepare for the Phillips curve, that part of the test, you really have to be real keen and sharp on the determinants for ag demand and the determinants for ag supply. Input prices are a big one. That's the one they like to ask a lot. But because I've just said input prices are the one they like to ask a lot, remember the AP writers aren't like, let's just continue to confirm what teachers are teaching. Instead, they want to make sure that you guys know this stuff. And so they're not going to just ask input prices. Remember, inventories have a big impact on ag supply, and as do what we call capital stock. Inventories, like. So we're going to talk a little bit more about inventories and ag supply. We'll do that in the next few days. But they're going to have an effect on ag supply. So in order to really prepare for the Phillips curve, you guys all, I think with just that explanation, are going to understand, okay, ag demand moves, it's the dot moving, ag supply moves, it's the whole line moving. You guys are all aware and smart enough to get that. But again, they're going to really test you on the determinants of ag demand, ag supply. That's how they're going to test on the Phillips curve. And you know the nice thing, one of the hardest FRQs was last year's number 1, and we're going to do that as a practice. Yeah.
So if you shift
Not today,
the
though.
short run and ag supply left, the short run Phillips curve goes right.
Yes. So what I do in order to like proof this or double check that I'm shifting things in the right way or something like that, if they don't give you inflation numbers, make them up. Say that's, you know, at long run equilibrium, it's 2% inflation, and you know the natural rate. And then if you see on this that inflation increased, okay, as unemployment decreased, then you know that, okay, so now the new numbers should be higher. But if it's like, if it maintains 2%, but unemployment has skyrocketed, then you know that to maintain this 2% right down here, okay, and unemployment is now increased, you're going to have to draw a brand new curve. To the right, yeah. So again, making up, like putting on fake numbers, I think is helpful. So if nothing happens with inflation, but they keep messing with the unemployment rate, then you know that's an ag supply issue. Okay, so then you know that the Phillips curve is moving. Whereas if the unemployment rate and inflation are both moving and making a difference, then you know that that's going to be a movement along the curve that you currently have. So this, again, is more about practice than anything. And like I said, the 2017 FRQ number 1, that was a Phillips curve specific. And I think 2016, the FRQ, I think it was number 2. was a Phillips Curve one. So they're testing the Phillips Curve more and more. This, because the Phillips Curve and the ag demand, ag supply curve both correlate, and because you guys have learned the money supply or the money market graph, loanable funds and ag demand graphs all correlate, guess what kind of fun things that they can throw out? All the graphs that you know in this class, they can all put into one big FRQ, and they like doing that. So we'll continue to practice with that, and then when we learn foreign exchange, that's a whole different thing that affects ag supply. So guess what? It can affect all this stuff too. I told you the thing about macros is conceptual. All this stuff kind of interacts with one another. So we're going to continue to talk about that, but not today.